the janitor who moved like silence. The janitor arrived long before anyone else, slipping through the side entrance of Briarwood High with the quiet certainty of someone who had walked these halls for a lifetime. Dawn had not yet broken. Only the pale suggestion of morning, pressed weakly against the narrow windows, scattering faint blue shadows across the floor. In that half-light, he moved like a figure whose edges didn't belong entirely to the world around him, gliding, deliberate, almost fluid. The old building greeted him with its familiar orchestra of settling pipes, murmuring vents, and the distant groan of the gymnasium rafters, as though it recognized him not as an intruder, but as an early witness to its secrets. His keys jingled softly at his hip, but even that sound felt somehow muted, as if the air agreed to swallow any noise he made. He pushed his cart down the main corridor, the wheels rolling with a smoothness that defied their age. Every morning, he performed this ritual with the same unbroken precision, flicking on only the lights he needed, letting the rest of the building remain cloaked in a quiet darkness that seemed almost protective. He worked with a steady, almost reverent patience, wiping the glass trophy cases as though each award held a story he alone remembered. His movements had a strangely rhythmic grace, the kind that felt less like cleaning and more like choreography. Every gesture measured, every action purposeful, as if he understood the building's heartbeat and timed himself to match its rhythm. Few people noticed him during the day, and fewer still cared to wonder about him when they did. To most students, he was simply the quiet man in the dark green uniform, the one who appeared and disappeared with uncanny awareness of when he was needed, and who never raised his voice or wasted breath on conversation. He seemed always half listening to something others couldn't hear, pausing mid-task to tilt his head or glance toward a corner as though catching echoes no one else sensed. Teachers offered polite nods, but he responded with only a ghost of a smile, a brief flicker that never fully reached his eyes. There was nothing threatening about him, but there was an unmistakable depth, an old, weathered intensity that made people instinctively avoid intruding upon his solitude. But what no one knew, what no one even imagined, was that the janitor carried a history far heavier than the mop handle resting across his cart. Beneath the soft shuffle of his footsteps lay scars carved by years of walking roads, shadowed by danger, loss, and choices no man should have been forced to make. His past was a landscape of fractured memories, faces blurred by time, names he whispered only in dreams, promises he once thought he could keep. He had come to Briarwood seeking anonymity, intending to blend into the background like dust in a forgotten room. The school offered a sanctuary of sorts, a place where he could bury himself in routine and allow the world to believe he was nothing more than a quiet custodian with kind eyes and tired hands. Yet, even as he swept the halls and emptied the trash bins, something in the silence of the building tugged at the edges of his mind. There were moments when he felt as though the shadows were shifting differently around him, bending subtly as if recognizing him, not the janitor he pretended to be, but the man he once was. He tried to ignore it, dismissing the feeling as residue from an old life he was determined to outrun. Still, the school had a way of listening, of sensing things unspoken, and in its stillness, he sometimes sensed an unsettling truth, that everything he hoped to leave behind would not remain buried forever. That morning, as he paused beneath the flickering light near the science wing, he felt a faint prickle along the back of his neck, a whisper of instinct he thought he had trained out of himself. He stood there for a long moment, mop in hand, staring down the dim hallway as if something waited there, just out of sight. The building was silent, but it was not the peaceful silence he had grown accustomed to. It was a silence that seemed to be holding its breath, and though he could not yet explain why, he knew with an unshakable certainty that his quiet life, the life he had worked so hard to build, was beginning to crack at the edges. Something was coming, and the man who moved like silence could already feel it. The girl who saw what others missed. Mara Thompson had always felt that the world revealed itself to her in ways it didn't for anyone else. It wasn't something she bragged about, or even spoke aloud. It was simply a quiet truth she tucked behind her steady gaze. A truth she carried like a lantern in dark places. Where other students rushed through the halls of Briarwood High without looking, Mara noticed the subtle things, the slight tilt of a forgotten photograph on the bulletin board, the strange pattern the dust made on the windowsill near the old music room, the way certain doors sometimes seemed to shift open by an inch, even when there was no draft to explain it. Teachers often said she had an observant mind, the sort that made her a natural forensics student in the advanced science program. But none of them realized just how deeply her instincts ran. She didn't just observe, she absorbed, she cataloged, she felt the pulse beneath the surface of ordinary things. On the morning the janitor entered the school with that unusual stillness clinging to him, Mara arrived earlier than usual, her backpack slung heavy over her shoulder and her headphones wrapped around her neck instead of her ears. She stepped through the front entrance, expecting the familiar quiet of an empty school. But something felt different the moment she pushed the door open. There was an atmosphere, an almost imperceptible shift in the air, like entering a room where someone had been speaking just moments before, and the words were still hanging faintly, invisibly, waiting for someone else to notice. Mara paused, letting her eyes adjust to the half-lit corridor, and it was then she saw him. The janitor moved down the far end of the hallway with a grace that struck her immediately. Most people barely glanced at him, rarely seeing anything more than the uniform or the mop and bucket. But Mara's attention locked onto him with a sense of instinctive curiosity. She noticed the way his posture changed ever so slightly as he worked a small tension in his shoulders, a subtle alertness in the way he scanned the corners of the hallway when he thought no one was watching. There was a deliberate quietness to his movement. Not the quietness of someone trying not to disturb, but the quietness of someone who knew how to navigate spaces without drawing attention. That, more than anything, made her look twice. She had seen him for years. Everyone had, but this morning something felt different, almost wrong. His usual calm appeared strained, stretched like a thread pulled too tight. He moved as if listening to something beneath the hum of the lights, something Mara herself could not quite perceive. She watched him for a long moment, trying to make sense of the unease prickling at the back of her mind. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. The janitor carried the same kind of weight she had seen once in her father's eyes, the weight of someone who knew danger intimately, who anticipated it the way others anticipated the ringing of the school bell. Mara shook off the thought and made her way to her locker, but she couldn't shake the quiet feeling that lingered. She walked more slowly than usual, scanning the hall with the careful precision that had always seemed natural to her. Something in the air felt charged, as though the building itself was waiting, holding on to a secret it was not yet ready to reveal. She noticed small details she had never paid attention to before. The faint scuff marks on the floor near the emergency exit, the way the security camera near the library blinked twice before going still, the slight tremor in the vent above the water fountain as though something had recently disturbed the airflow. When she reached her locker, she hesitated, letting her fingers rest on the cool metal. For reasons she couldn't name, she felt as if opening it would break the strange tension that had woven itself through the morning. Before she could turn the dial, she sensed a presence behind her, not close enough to startle her, but close enough to be felt. She turned and found the janitor walking past, pushing his cart with the same silent precision she had noticed earlier. For a fleeting second, their eyes met. His gaze held a depth that startled her, the look of a man who carried too many memories and trusted too few people. There was an unspoken question in his eyes, as though he wondered whether she had noticed something she wasn't supposed to. Mara offered him a polite nod, and he returned it with a faint, almost cautious half-smile before continuing down the hall. But that brief exchange left her with a resonance she couldn't ignore. Something had shifted. Someone who was meant to remain invisible had just stepped into the edges of her awareness, and she sensed without knowing why that their lives were on the verge of becoming entangled in ways neither of them expected. As the first warning bell echoed through the corridor, Mara closed her locker and took one last look down the hall where the janitor had disappeared. She didn't know what was coming, not even in the sharp, intuitive way she usually sensed trouble. All she knew was that the quiet morning felt like the breath before a storm, and she was suddenly certain that whatever secrets Briarwood High had been keeping were about to surface. And somehow, she and the janitor were both standing at the very center of it. The unsettling discovery. The first period of the day had barely begun when Mara felt the strange tension coil tighter inside the school, as if the building itself were aware of something stirring behind its walls. She tried focusing on the lecture, tried pretending her attention wasn't drifting toward every small sound that echoed through the hallways beyond the classroom door. But her instincts, those stubborn, perceptive instincts she had never managed to shut off, kept tugging her thoughts back to the janitor and the lingering unease she had felt earlier. When the teacher turned to write an equation on the board, Mara stole a glance at the hallway. She expected to see nothing but the blur of students arriving late. Instead, she caught sight of something that made her pulse skip, a faint flicker in the corner near the stairwell, like someone had moved quickly out of frame. It wasn't a shadow caused by lights or movement. It was abrupt, almost intentional, as if someone or something was pulling away just fast enough not to be seen. She spent the rest of class half listening and half analyzing the sensation that refused to leave her alone. When the bell finally rang, she moved with purpose, slipping out before most of the class had even packed their bags. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, but she trusted her instincts enough to follow the thread of unease wherever it led. Her steps carried her down the east corridor, a quieter wing of the school where only a few elective classrooms were located. It was a place students rarely visited unless they had a reason, which was precisely why Mara was drawn to it. As she approached the end of the hall, she noticed something unusual on the floor. Fine, pale granules scattered in a thin, uneven trail, almost like sand or dust that didn't belong anywhere near the old brick structure of the school. Mara crouched down, carefully brushing her fingers across the particles. They felt gritty but strangely cold, as though they had been touched by a draft that didn't exist. She followed the trail with her eyes and realized it led directly toward one of the storage rooms that was usually kept locked. A faint uneasiness crawled across her skin, but curiosity pulled her forward. She reached the door, pressed her ear against the metal, and listened. At first, she heard nothing but the humming of the overhead lights, but after a moment, she picked up a faint, rhythmic tapping from inside. Soft, controlled, nothing like the loud, clumsy sounds of maintenance. It was the kind of tapping someone might make intentionally, like a message being sent to someone listening. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, just as another sound echoed from down the hallway, the rolling wheels of a cart. She straightened quickly, and the janitor appeared from around the corner, his expression unusually tight when he noticed where she was standing. His eyes flicked from her to the storage room door and back again with a sudden alertness that made her breath catch. He didn't speak at first. He merely let the silence stretch between them like a carefully placed line neither of them had meant to cross. The cart glided to a halt beside him, and the soft squeak of its wheels faded into the tense stillness. For a moment, Mara thought he would simply tell her to move along, that she wasn't allowed near the storage area, and that would be the end of it. But instead, he scanned the hallway with the wary precision of someone assessing threats. Someone who had learned the importance of checking every corner before revealing even a fraction of the truth. Then his gaze settled on her, steady and piercing, as though he were trying to determine whether she had seen too much. There was something heavy in his eyes, something that hinted at fear, not for himself but for what might happen if certain doors were opened by the wrong hands. "You shouldn't be here," he finally said, his voice low, almost strained, a voice that carried the unmistakable weight of warning. Most students would have apologized and backed away immediately, intimidated by the uncharacteristic intensity of his tone. But Mara held his gaze, trying to piece together the confusion swirling around her. She sensed he wasn't trying to keep her out of trouble. He was trying to keep her safe. That realization sent a cold ripple down her spine. "I heard something in there," she said quietly. "And there's something on the floor. It isn't normal dust." The janitor's jaw tightened. For a fraction of a second, something vulnerable flickered through his expression: fear, recognition, or perhaps a memory he did not want resurfacing. He stepped closer, placing himself subtly between her and the storage room door with the kind of instinctive protectiveness that spoke of long-buried habits. The air around them seemed to shift, as though they were standing on the threshold of something far greater than either of them understood. Before he could respond, A loud crash erupted from inside the storage room, a violent, metallic clatter that made Mara jerk back in shock. It wasn't the sound of a mop or box falling. It was the sound of something big, something powerful, slamming against the metal shelves. The janitor reacted instantly, his posture snapping into place with a readiness that stunned her. No hesitation, no fear, only sharp, trained reflexes. He grabbed the door handle with a controlled urgency, his voice dropping into a tone colder and more commanding than she had ever heard from him. "Mara," he said, not unkindly but firmly, with a finality that allowed no argument. "Go. Now." She hesitated, torn between the instinct to listen and the instinct that told her the truth was hiding right behind that door. But the look in his eyes, an intensity carved from past battles she could only imagine, told her one thing clearly. Whatever was inside that room was not something she was meant to face. Not yet. Reluctantly, she stepped back, watching as the janitor braced himself, his hand tightening on the door handle with the controlled fear of someone who had learned long ago that danger often waited behind ordinary doors. She had taken only 3 steps down the hallway when she heard him exhale a slow, steadying breath that carried the weight of a man preparing to confront a nightmare he thought he had left behind. And somewhere inside that dark storage room, something waited. Something that had not moved like a box or a broom. Something that had moved with purpose. Mara didn't know it yet. But this moment, this single decision to walk away, would be the last time she could pretend her life was anything close to ordinary. Because, whatever the janitor was hiding, it was only the beginning. What hides behind locked doors? The moment Mara disappeared around the corner, the hallway fell into a heavy stillness that felt almost alive, as if the very air were bracing itself for what was about to happen. The janitor's hand tightened around the cold metal of the storage room door, and for a heartbeat he simply stood there, breathing in the silence as though steadying himself for something he had hoped never to face again. His expression hardened, the soft edges of his usual quiet demeanor falling away like a mask slipping off to reveal the steel beneath. Whatever lurked behind that door wasn't new to him. The fear that flickered in his eyes wasn't the panic of a man unprepared, but the weary recognition of someone confronting a familiar ghost. He leaned his weight into the handle, bracing his body in a stance taught only through years of necessity. And then he pulled the door open with a sharp, controlled force. The room exploded into chaos the moment the door gave way. A blast of cold air rushed outward, unnaturally frigid for a windowless storage space, carrying with it a smell that made the janitor's stomach twist, metallic, ancient, and unmistakably wrong. Shelves were thrown askew, cleaning supplies scattered like someone had ransacked the place with violent intent. The shadows at the back of the room twisted in ways no shadows should, bending and recoiling as if trying to evade the faint strip of light slicing in from the hallway. The janitor stepped inside slowly, his boots crunching over the strange pale dust that had seeped out earlier. He closed the door behind him with a deliberate click, sealing himself in the darkness. He reached for the flashlight clipped to his belt, flicked it on, and its beam cut through the room like a blade. It landed immediately on the far wall, where deep, claw-like gouges had torn through the drywall. They weren't random. They were patterned, curved in a deliberate arc, as if whatever had made them was testing its restraints, testing the strength of the room, or perhaps testing him. He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of an old memory resurface of nights spent tracking things that moved in shadows, of creatures that left behind marks almost identical to these. His hand shook only slightly as he raised the flashlight higher, illuminating the overturned mop bucket, the shattered jar of industrial cleaner, the splintered handle of a broom snapped clean in half like a toothpick. Then he saw it. In the corner, near the old metal ventilation grate, something had forced its way through the wall. Not a person. These holes were too narrow, too irregular, and the material surrounding them rippled outward as though melted rather than broken. A small pool of that same granular, pale residue dusted the floor beneath the opening, and the janitor felt his breath catch in his throat. It wasn't dust. It was fallout. What remained after something unnatural slipped its way into places it didn't belong. He knelt slowly, running his gloved hand across the particles. They shimmered faintly under the flashlight, reacting to the touch like they were alive or remembering something. He pulled his hand back as a rare, sharp fear rose inside him. This wasn't supposed to follow him here. Not to Briarwood High. Not to the place he had chosen to disappear. He stood again, scanning the room, tracing the path of the disturbance. Whatever had broken free had moved fast, slithering, or crawling, or shifting in a way that defied natural anatomy. It had escaped through the thin ventilation shaft in the wall, a place no human could fit, but something else could. Something that had followed him from a darker chapter of his past, something he had hoped he had destroyed. His mind raced, not with panic, but with calculation. He needed to seal off the vents before it spread. He needed to track it before anyone else encountered it. He needed to keep Mara, and every other unsuspecting student, far away from the truth gnawing its way under the school. He flicked off the flashlight and pushed himself out of the room, closing the door behind him as quietly as he had opened it. The hallway was still empty, but now it felt different, not still but watchful, as if the building's shadows were paying attention to him. He locked the door, pocketed the key, and stood there with the weight of dread pressing against his ribs. He had tried so hard to vanish into this quiet job, to become nothing more than a man sweeping floors and mopping up spills. But danger had a way of finding him no matter how far he ran, and now it was threading its way through the ductwork of Briarwood High, waiting for its moment to reveal itself. He walked down the hall toward the main corridor, eyes scanning every vent, every crack, every flicker of shadow. He felt the thing's presence now, the faint vibration of something crawling where it shouldn't, a whisper of movement behind the walls that only he could detect. And somewhere not far away, Mara was moving through the school, unaware that she had wandered into a story far bigger and far darker than she could ever imagine. As he turned the corner, he heard a distant sound echo through the hallways. It was soft, almost delicate, like a fingernail dragging along metal in a slow, deliberate stroke. Then another, and another. Growing closer, the janitor froze, his breath held tight in his chest. Whatever lived behind that door was no longer behind it. The sound that didn't belong. The sound slid through the hallways with a chilling delicacy. A thin, metallic whisper that scraped along the air like the quiet note of a blade drawn too slowly from its sheath. The janitor stopped mid-step, every muscle in his body turning to stone as the echo rippled toward him, threading through the vents, bouncing off the lockers, and dissolving into the fluorescent hum hanging above the corridor. It was a sound he had heard before years ago, in places far colder and far darker than the quiet corridors of Briarwood High. A sound that once meant he had only seconds to act before something slipped free from the edges of the world's logic. The past he had buried under layers of false names, forged identification, and careful routines surged back into him with a violent clarity, dragging behind it memories he had spent long nights trying to forget. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping across the dim corridor with a sharpness that did not belong to a simple custodian. The air felt heavier now, thickened by a presence that lurked just beyond the reach of the lights. The vents overhead rattled softly, as if breath were passing through them, forcing the metal to tremble with each haunting exhale. He stepped forward, his movements controlled but tense, and the faint scent of ozone ghosted across his senses, an electric tang that did not belong in a school hallway. It clung to the air like the residue of a storm that hadn't yet arrived. His hand drifted instinctively toward the small pocket near the seam of his uniform, brushing the concealed utility blade he kept there, not because he believed it would stop the thing stalking the vents, but because old habits died only when the man who held them did. Upstairs, faint and distant, the rambunctious chatter of students transitioning between classes drifted through the building. Their voices rose and fell in chaotic bursts, blissfully unaware that something was moving just beneath their feet. The normalcy of it felt almost sinister in contrast to the ominous stillness that clung to the lower corridor. The janitor closed his eyes for a moment, letting the familiar sounds of adolescents' footsteps, locker slams, laughter anchor him in the present. But even then, the scraping persisted, a quiet pulse threading beneath the ordinary noise like an unwelcome heartbeat. Somewhere above him, Mara was walking these very halls, and the thought of her unknowingly crossing paths with the thing slithering behind the walls ignited a spark of dread he hadn't felt in years. He didn't know why she was the first face in his mind, maybe because she had seen too much already, maybe because she possessed that unsettling intuition that made him worry she would follow the wrong clue down the wrong hallway. Or maybe because her eyes, sharp and curious, reminded him of someone he had once promised to protect and failed. The memory stung like old scar tissue touched by unexpected heat, and he inhaled deeply, forcing his voice of regret back into the dark corner he had taught it to live in. He moved again, faster this time, tracing the path of the sound with an expertise that spoke of training far beyond anything a school custodial job required. He slid his hand along the lockers, pressing his ear briefly against the cool metal as he listened. The noise grew louder near the intersection of the corridor and the stairwell leading to the basement, another location he dreaded. Not because of the darkness below, but because he had long suspected the building held more secrets beneath its floorboards than anyone at Briarwood realized. When he had first accepted the job, he had discovered sealed rooms in the basement, storage areas with no records, spaces that felt older than the rest of the school, as if the foundations had been built on something forgotten. He had never opened them. He had never wanted to. Yet now, the sound was drawing him exactly there. He reached the stairwell door and paused, his fingers hovering above the handle. The hairs along his arms lifted as a deeper, more resonant vibration rolled upward from the darkness below. Slow, deliberate, almost probing. It was the kind of movement that belonged to a creature learning its environment, adjusting to its newfound freedom, testing the boundaries of this unfamiliar place. He pushed the door open just an inch, allowing a sliver of cool, stale air to escape. The scent was unmistakable. The same metallic tang mixed with the strange, cold residue he had seen earlier. Whatever had escaped through the vent was not small anymore. It had grown, or shed something, or changed shape in a way that made his pulse throb with dread. For a moment, he remained completely still, letting the darkness breathe against him. His mind raced through possibilities, calculations, the fragmented knowledge of what such creatures were capable of. Then a new sound drifted up, a soft, almost human murmur, like someone whispering from deep below. His blood ran cold. The thing had learned to mimic. It was trying to lure. It had done this before. He stepped back, letting the stairwell door fall shut with a low, echoing click. He could not go down there alone. Not this time, not without preparation. Not when the stakes were no longer his survival, but the safety of hundreds of unsuspecting students. He needed to barricade the lower floor, seal every exit, and somehow track the creature's movements before it found someone wandering too close. The problem was that he could not do any of that without drawing attention. For years, he had lived invisible. Now, invisibility was a luxury he could no longer afford. And above him, moving at her own pace, Mara was getting closer to discovering the truth. He exhaled, long and heavy, the sound trembling at the edges. The past he had outrun was no longer behind him. It was crawling through the walls, hunting him, pulling him back into the shadows he had abandoned. And he knew with growing certainty that the next sound he heard, the next scrape, the next whisper, might not come from the vents. It might come from someone screaming, the girl who walked into the dark without knowing it. Mara didn't notice how quiet the hallway had become behind her, nor did she notice the subtle way her footsteps echoed more sharply than usual against the tile floor. She had always walked these corridors with a sense of casual confidence, the kind of boldness found in people who spent their lives observing the world rather than fearing it. Her notebook was tucked under her arm, filled with scribbled observations, from the morning a short list of questions that had grown into something larger, deeper, and far more troubling. For weeks, she had sensed something peculiar lingering around the janitor, something that didn't match the mundane tasks he performed. He moved too deliberately. He watched too quietly. There was a precision about him that didn't belong in the world of mops and trash bags. Mara, being who she was, had taken notice. And being who she was, she had not let go. She rounded the corner near the science wing and slowed her steps, absorbing the strange stillness hanging in the air. The hallway lights flickered once, a gentle pulse, like a heartbeat, skipping out of rhythm. She frowned, tilting her head slightly, as if listening to a language no one else could hear. It was not unusual for Briarwood High to experience electrical glitches. The building was old, its wiring older, but the sensation that followed was something wholly different. A cold breath of air brushed past her, slipping down the back of her neck in a way that felt intentional, almost inquisitive. She stopped walking. Her eyes scanned the vents above her, the shadows below her, and the long stretch of corridor ahead. Nothing moved, but the air felt heavier, as though someone had exhaled deeply in her ear and now waited for her reaction. She clutched her notebook tighter. She had spent her childhood noticing the things others ignored, the faint hum beneath daily life that hinted at patterns and meanings hidden from casual eyes. Most people learn to tune out the unexplainable. Mara, however, had never been able to silence her instincts, and this instinct screamed that something was watching her. But from where? The vents? The ceiling tiles? The cracks between the lockers? Or something deeper, something embedded in the building itself? She stepped forward again, this time more cautiously, and her shoes scuffed a faint smear across the floor. It looked like dust at first, a thin gray trail, but something about its texture made her crouch down for a closer look. It wasn't dust. It wasn't dirt. It was almost metallic, with a faint shimmer like powdered graphite mixed with something biological. She touched it lightly with the tip of her pencil, and the substance clung to the wood with a sticky reluctance, as if it were alive. She drew back, her heartbeat picking up speed, and watched as the smear slowly curled inward, tightening itself into a finer line as though responding to her movement. "What are you?" she whispered under her breath. But the corridor offered no answer, only the faint hum of fluorescent lights trembling overhead. She straightened slowly, glancing back the way she had come. She expected to see students walking past the intersecting hallways, expected to hear distant chatter or the slam of a locker echoing through the building. But the entire floor seemed abandoned, drained of life in a way that tightened the muscles along her spine. She felt as though she had stepped out of the school she knew and into an imitation, a hollow replica, missing all the familiar noise. She took a step back, feeling the fine hairs on her arms rise with a prickling alertness she could not explain. The air felt charged now, carrying the same subtle metallic scent she had noticed earlier near the janitor's closet. Her mind made a connection she wasn't yet ready to believe. Something had moved through this hallway, something not human. Her thoughts raced with a speed her body could not keep up with. Where was everyone? Why did the lower floor feel emptied of life? Why had the janitor, with all his quiet strangeness, seemed so tense earlier that morning? She replayed their brief interaction in her mind, the way his gaze had flicked toward the vents, the way he had paused too long before answering her question about the basement keys. He hadn't lied, exactly, but he had held something back, something heavy, something dangerous. Mara's breath hitched when a faint, rhythmic tapping sounded behind her, followed by the soft hiss of air moving through the vents. She spun around, heart thundering, but the hallway remained unchanged, same lockers, same flickering lights, same eerie stillness. But the tapping continued, soft but deliberate, like a creature testing the boundaries of a cage it had just realized was open. The sound crawled along the walls, slipping through the air with a predatory curiosity, moving closer, then retreating, then creeping forward again, as if trying to map her position through sound alone. Her pulse hammered against her ribcage. She forced herself to breathe slowly, quietly, barely widening her stance as she tried to pinpoint the direction of the noise. She had never believed in ghosts or monsters, at least not the kind found in books or movies, but she did believe in patterns. And nothing about this pattern belonged to a natural source. The tapping turned into a gentle scrape, the scrape into a hollow knock, and the knock into a sound that did not belong to this world, an almost vocal resonance, low and distorted, like the garbled echo of a word attempted by something that did not understand how human speech worked. Her skin went cold. The sound was mimicking someone, something, learning. She backed away slowly, her steps soft, careful not to alert whatever intelligence lurked inside the vent system. She knew, instinctively and profoundly, that she could not let it know she had heard it. She moved with the kind of cautious precision she normally reserved for her late-night walks in the forest near her home, a place where predators watched from underbrush and silence meant survival. But here, in the familiar hallways of her school, the act felt surreal, like the walls had shifted while she wasn't looking. As she reached the intersection leading toward the main stairwell, her mind made a decision before her body caught up with it. She needed to find him, the janitor. Whatever secret he was hiding beneath his calm demeanor was tied to what she had just heard. She didn't know how she knew, but she trusted her intuition more than most people trusted facts. He would understand the thing in the vents. He would know what to do. He would know how dangerous it was. But as she turned toward the stairwell, a new sound made her freeze. Footsteps. Not hers. Slow. Heavy. Uneven. They came from the shadowed end of the hallway she had just stepped away from, the same direction where the metallic dust trail began. And with every measured step, the air grew colder, the lights flickered harder, and a low hum vibrated through the floor tiles beneath her feet. She felt a slow dread wrap around her like a tightening band, urging her to run, to hide, to vanish into the nearest door. But her instincts, those same instincts that had led her into mysteries her entire life, compelled her to turn around. And when she did, she realized the darkness at the end of the hall was no longer empty. Something stood inside it. Something tall. Something wrong. Something that had learned how to shape itself into the silhouette of a person. Mara's breath caught in her throat, her heartbeat slamming against her ribs with suffocating force. The figure did not speak, did not move, did not blink. It simply stood there, its impossibly still form bathed in shadow, as though deciding what shape it wanted to keep. And in that terrifying stillness, Mara understood one thing with perfect clarity. The janitor was not the only one hiding a past. Something else had been waiting in the walls. Something older. Something hungry.